What is up, everyone? Happy September 15th. Hope everyone has had an amazing week. Excited to get back into trying to do these regularly. I know I had like a 2-week break a little while ago. No guests today, but we have some really interesting stuff to cover, specifically for the Canadians in the audience. But I think there's a little something in here for everyone when it comes to history lessons and things that might happen in your country, wherever you are. Quick reminder for the show. If you haven't already, please give this video a thumbs up if you're on YouTube, Twitter, Nostr, wherever you're watching the stream today. Really appreciate it. Helps it get out to more people, of course. But yeah, today we're going to be talking about Justin Trudeau, the Liberals, Canada, possibly implementing some version of price controls on food because of just how crazy food prices have spiraled out of control with inflation. We're going to be talking about yet another massive institution putting a Bitcoin ETF forward. We're going to talk about oil prices in the short term, in the long term. All these stories all tied up together in a wonderful bow. And yeah, hopefully you'll learn something. I learned a lot today, just researching these subjects, and I'm super, super excited to kind of show and talk about that with you. And of course, this is an interactive show. Specifically, if you are watching on YouTube, feel free to leave a comment. I will be bringing comments up as I discuss certain articles. You know me, sometimes I'm right about things. I'm bang on right. I'm like the best commentator you've ever heard. Other times, I don't know what the hell I'm talking about. So chime in either way. Really appreciate it. There's always something to learn from you guys as well. Real quick, before we get started with the news, a quick shout out to the sponsor of the show, Beaver Bitcoin, who allows me to make the show, get it out to you guys. If you're looking for a really easy way to get Bitcoin into a cold wallet without having to deal with exchanges and all this other nonsense, Beaver Bitcoin lets you go from your bank to Bitcoin to a cold wallet, probably the easiest way there is. Take a look, and then we'll jump into it. This week's show is brought to you by Beaver Bitcoin. Dollar cost averaging is the most stress-free method to enter the Bitcoin space. And if you're looking for a simplified way of buying Bitcoin in Canada without needing to rely on a custodial exchange, Beaver Bitcoin is your best bet. Beaver Bitcoin lets you set up recurring Bitcoin purchases directly from your Canadian bank account and straight into a Bitcoin address that you control. It's like a savings account in a currency that you actually want, or a Netflix subscription that doesn't suck. And if you don't want to wait to stack sats, Beaver Bitcoin supports instant non-custodial Bitcoin buying via e-transfer as well. Give it a shot today at beaverbitcoin.com. Alrighty, so first things first, let's dive into the reality of this. I have started to do a bit more clickbaity titles and all that, but just to clarify, no, Justin Trudeau, Canada has not literally proposed price controls yet, but they're doing something very similar, and these things all lead into one another. But yeah, that'll be the first kind of story here. So Justin Trudeau coming out this week, threatening grocery chains with going too fast. I'll slow it down a bit. Trudeau threatening grocery chains with more taxes if they won't lower prices. So Trudeau says the heads of large grocery stores need to come up with a plan to stabilize food prices. And he says, let me be very clear, if their plan does not provide real relief, then we will take further action, and we are not ruling anything out, including tax measures. And so this all comes from, if you've been in Canada, you've been following the political scene, you've probably heard a lot of stuff coming out from 2 or 3 specific political parties here about how grocery chains are price gouging their consumers right now. Lots of info, statistics out there about how they're posting record profits. We have a bunch of grocery chains here, Sobeys, Superstore, Loblaws, all that stuff. Record profits on their end, CEO bonuses. And this doesn't really make a lot of sense when, average Canadians are struggling right now. And especially the grocery industry, one that is very, heavily regulated. Doesn't make sense for them to be coming away with all this excess profit. But alas, that is essentially what a lot of the main government in charge is basically accusing them of. And so I wanted to kind of dig into that a little bit, because I think there is a bit of truth there. They're not just pulling these statistics and claims completely out of their butts, but there's a lot of stuff that is said specifically by, let's call it the left-leaning party in Canada, the NDP, which is just very easily debunked about corporate profits and the way some of these chains are making their money. One thing to think about when you think about grocery stores and grocery chains is, unlike the tech industry, healthcare, manufacturing, all sorts of other businesses in the world, Grocery chains make an average profit margin of around, I believe, 1 to 2 to 3%. So very similar to gas stations. They're not making massive profit margins. It's not a super lucrative business to get into. As an independent grocer, as just buying one of these grocery chains as a stock investment, these are not high growth industries. People consume more or less at a constant rate based on the change of population, and food prices reflect inflation, gas prices and other things like that. But ultimately downstream, grocery chains as a whole they're not making exorbitant profit margins as you might see in, really fast growing tech startups or anything like that. So just kind of a good mental model to frame around this. That being said, you have Jagmeet Singh, and he is one of the leaders of Canada's left-leaning parties, coming out basically talking about how Sobeys, which is one of the largest chains here, posting a 52% increase in profits. So he has a little rant video here. I'm not going to play this whole thing, having some problems with audio from my screen, but essentially he's calling out, greedy CEOs, corporations making record profits, amidst crazy food inflation. And again, we've all seen it. We've seen the price of eggs, milk, salads, all that stuff just skyrocket. But let's dive into his claim here. So his claim is that Sobeys, which is a big grocery chain in Canada, which is under the umbrella of another big company called Empire, posted a 52% increase in profits. Well, number one, he's saying Sobeys, that sole entity, is posting that increase in profits when that's not the case. He's actually citing the earnings of the parent company. And one of the things about that parent company, it's called Empire & Co., is that, yes, they have posted a massive increase in the last quarter, 261 million, up from 187 million in the previous quarter. But that was boosted by the sale of 56 gas stations in Western Canada to Shell Canada. When you actually break down the earnings, you can see a majority of that profit has come from the sale of gas stations. So I wouldn't really say it's a fair comparison to say that grocery chain has made a 56%, or 52% increase in profit. And actually, when you look at their quarterly earnings, and you actually see, their month over month and year over year profit, their quarterly earnings have fallen, and they were actually quite negative only a few years ago. So again, not a fun industry to invest in. I don't want to, seem super sympathetic to grocery chains and how all that stuff works, but it's not really adding up, these claims that there are exorbitant profits with these, these CEOs, and corporations that own grocery stores. It just doesn't really add up. I have another chart here. I will pull it up, but I was just curious what the profit margin is, because ultimately you can look at revenue as like a factor, how many in sales that you're doing and gross profit. You can look at these things as factors, but I think profit margins also tell a factor when it comes to greed, because what a profit margin ultimately tells you is how much you're marking up the producer of a good, the production of goods, how much you're marking it up to the retail or the industrial consumer. So especially with grocery stores, I think looking at profit margins is probably the most accurate sense in kind of figuring out if there is a sense of excess greed, because 70-80% of the cost of groceries is just what the producer is paying for it. Similar to how gas stations work. When you go get gas at a gas station, we'll actually get into a lot of stats on gas in a little bit. But when you go to a gas station, for instance, on every liter of gas that Shell or Chevron sells, they're only making about 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 pennies per dollar of gasoline that they've sold. So again, what you're looking at is a really tight profit margin. And when you actually dig into what the profit margin is of Empire, yes, it's up. But it hasn't really, been that changed since about 2016 and 2018. And, there's always a bigger picture to these stats. Just because you have a higher profit margin doesn't mean all of a sudden you've decided to start, jacking up the amounts that you charge on things relative to what you're paying for them as well. There's a whole bunch of other factors at play. So if you just look historically on this chart, I don't know if it's super visible on smaller screens. You can see that, yes, April 30th, 2023, a 2.4% profit margin. And then if you go back to, 2019 pre-pandemic, 1.94, 1%, 1.6%. There's a couple quarters in here that looked really negative. That might have been, again, because of an M&A sale or something like that. But we can go back to 2013. We got 3% profit margins, and then back in 2012, 2.3% profit margins, 2.2% profit margins. And yes, it has looked thoroughly consistent in the mid 2% for their profit margins. But to me, when I look at that, I don't see a company price gouging. I think it shows up in the net margin data if a company is price gouging. I think you see it in pharmaceuticals all the time. You'll see a pharmaceutical company running at near losses for years on end. And then all of a sudden they'll have a breakthrough product. And then you'll see, wait, 80% profit margins, 90% profit margins. And you look at pharmaceuticals like Moderna, for example. They're making all the things we put into our arms to prevent from the next boogeyman. Their profit margins doubled overnight because instead of giving this fixed rate for their vaccine to the government, because the government kind of sets the amount that they want to pay, and they also therefore kind of set like the net profit margin. The government said, hey, you can start charging us more for this vaccine now, and we'll still pay for it. We'll uncap basically how much you'll let us charge, because we know that you spent a lot of years researching and spent a lot of money on this. So, that things like that show that there's a lot of depth to these factors. And rather than just calling out, CEOs for being greedy, and again, I'm not for bonuses, and I'm not for CEOs walking away from grocery chains necessarily with, massive amounts of profit. But there's so much more to this industry than meets the eye. And if you think about it, if you were running a business with a 2% profit margin, that gives you very, very little wiggle room for things like supply chain disruptions. It gives you very little wiggle room for, a sudden increase in the cost of fuel. It gives you very little wiggle room for, expanding and changing the way your stores run. A big expense. And again, I don't want to come off like I'm sympathizing for these grocery chains, but there's a massive one-time expense to just getting in automated service checkouts, right? You have to pay a lot up front for all these machines in all your stores. And then eventually that will lower your cost of labor over the long run. But when you're running on a 1 to 2% margin, try doing that in a restaurant. Try doing that if you're a small business. You don't have any leg room to really try anything new. And so essentially, grocery chains and that business, they're very much tied to, what people are willing to pay. It's a very competitive business, despite it not looking like that, because there's multiple different chains. And ultimately, people are very price sensitive to food. A lot of people will just go to cheaper grocery stores if someone can beat it. And ultimately as well, like what Jeff Booth says, is that the cost of a good ultimately falls to its marginal production cost. And if we look at food over the long run, yes, a gallon of milk and a dozen eggs and all these things, they cost way more than they did in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And the prices of, food in the last 2 years have gone up way, way more than, the price of just, or the rate of just general inflation. But when you dig into those factors, you realize that it's not that all of a sudden the food becomes more expensive and scarce. It's not like the production becomes more difficult, like the soil isn't as good that year or anything like that, or external factors they can't control. It's all byproducts of things that are artificially put into the economy. Things like carbon taxes on fuel, which are driving up the cost of fuel for everyone in this country. Things like restrictions on how much and different practices on how much that farmers can grow things. Anti-competitive practices in farming, which allow giant factory farms to produce things way cheaper at a much better margin than small, small small farmers, let's just say, that want to sell locally. So a lot of people say grocery stores, they're price gouging everyone. Go to a farmer's market, go drive around to a local farm. You're going to see similar inflation rates for them too. The cost of their fertilizer is going up as well. The cost of their land tax is going up as well. So all of these things are affecting the price of food. And all of these things, if you really, really break it down, they're artificial constructs that can be changed politically or bureaucratically. It's not like these things are becoming more scarce. Our earth is not running out of food, and maybe it's running out of like good soil. But again, we have so many techniques to get better at this. And if you actually look at food production, it is a very deflationary thing. If you take out all the other inflationary aspects like the labor and the transportation, food production gets cheaper, better, and faster every single year. We can get a bigger yield on our food per square foot. You might not like that we put in, certain things in our fertilizer, but the fact is that more nitrogen in the soil makes for better food, whether you like it or not. We have machines now that can till and clean and pick foods at much faster rates than human laborers. That drives down the cost of food for everyone. Technology innovating in that sense. We have transportation that is getting more efficient, not less efficient over time. Trucks are better now on gasoline than they were, 30, 40 years ago when we're moving to a world of electric trucking. And when the price of transportation is tied to the price of electricity less than the price of fuel, there's so much more cost savings potential in that as well, right? Because then you start developing nuclear, geothermal, hydroelectric. If the cost of transportation is tied to the cost of electricity, not fuel, that's a massive way of creating deflation and savings in an economy. And that's, probably why a lot of people like Tesla and all these electric car manufacturers are pursuing that. It's a net good for everyone. So yeah, long story short, and we'll dive into the next part of this. A lot of the things that people say about grocery stores getting greedy are things that are out of their control. And ultimately, grocery stores have to maintain a margin. They're not sacrificial lambs. They're not, state owned, as many regulations as there are on them. They're not state owned or governed. They have to turn a profit, because if they don't, then they don't survive. They can't pay their workers. It's not too complicated, I would think. So what you have is then you have Trudeau coming out saying it's too much. We're going to put tax measures in place. And so these are some of the measures that Trudeau has talked about here. Three measures, and you can kind of think of them again as artificial constraints on supply or demand. So one of the measures he's talked about, he's also said tax measures, but other kind of regulatory measures, is he said that he wants to force these grocery chains and other businesses in this sector to participate in market studies. So what that essentially means is that right now, for example, when statisticians want to go in and they want to see, the price of bread over time, they send a guy to a store to write down the price of bread, right? They want grocery stores to start submitting, their prices to a general database, doing that work for them. Which, what does that do? That increases the cost for businesses. They have to implement, computer programs to gather that price data and send it over to the government. They may not want to have that data, so readily available to the government or anyone else too. It's gives their competition more of a leg up as well. At any rate, there would be more bureaucracy created, not only in the government, but more overhead in the companies as well to do more of these market studies for grocery stores. But that is one of the measures proposed by Trudeau, which doesn't seem like a way of really getting prices down to me. One of the other measures he wants to implement is preventing mergers on the basis of efficiency. So one of the, there's a lot of antitrust acts, and I actually think a lot of that stuff is good, for the most part, in breaking up monopolies. But you have to look at the world kind of holistically and realize that natural monopolies, or monopolies, are natural. They form in nature all the time. It's why, one tiger will get 90% of the women and the other tigers don't get any. Same with human men and human women, and same with species and creatures crowding out, ecodiversity, and same with plants. Monopolies exist in real life. Some of them are created by poor regulation, and some of them are just free market monopolies. And it's a little bit hard to distinguish between them. But, essentially, Trudeau wants to break up some of these monopolies as well in the food supply or grocery store area as well. Is it a good thing? I don't know, but I always think that there's secondary consequences to doing that. Could it reduce prices? I don't know, but I think to come out and say, yes, if we break up these grocery chains, if we break up Empire Co. and Sobeys has to be its own public company and they can't be all connected, we have to force sales here and there. I don't know if that's great for the consumer or for the economy in general. Could be, could also not be. And then lastly, the thing that they have kind of alluded to, the big reason that I say price controls, is that they've alluded to clawing back profit from these companies. So again, no empathy towards Empire Co. I don't care if those guys make profit or not. Hopefully they can survive, because that's where a lot of us get our groceries from. But when you look at these large superstores, And also, like, quick aside on this, I don't know how it works in the rest of the world for getting food, but certainly when I was traveling around Central America and Latin America, grocery chains did not have, as much proliferation in the general public as they do here. Like, everyone, when you want to get meat or candy or whatever, you are going to a big store to do it. And when you're in Latin America, and I think a lot of places in Europe and maybe Asia as well, you're going to open markets buying from, maybe not the same vendor each time. You're going to small little, like, tiendas or stores and things like that. And I realized, like, I think it's just like a cultural or habitual thing that, Americans and Canadians, when we want food, we go to the big Walmarts and we go to the superstores and the Safeways. And I don't think it's nearly, well, I know it's not nearly as common in other places I've gone. One of the things that you'll find as well, when you go to these countries and you go to their versions of Walmarts or Safeways, whether it be like Peru, Mexico, Costa Rica, or whatever, is that the grocery stores actually are not competitive with the locals. The locals will be growing stuff in their backyard. Their family will own their property generationally. They won't have as much property tax to pay. Maybe they're not even paying for labor sometimes because their kids are picking the crops. That's questionable in terms of a good thing for ethics. But because of those advantages, actually small producers are able to outcompete big chains, which have to buy from farms or they have to import certain goods to remain competitive. And so a lot of the time in those countries, people only go to superstores to buy imported goods that they can't get locally. So you wouldn't go to a Walmart to get eggs in Mexico. You would just get eggs from the vendor just down the street from you. And there's a lot of laws in those countries, or lack of laws, that enable it to be much easier for local vendors to sell food as well. And so you want to break up competition. You want to lower prices here, allow for more farmers markets, allow for people to sell food on the side of the street. I understand that there are trade-offs for that. I think, people getting Montezuma's revenge would increase. Number one, if you started letting every farmer kind of like sell stuff, maybe they don't wash their hands enough, or maybe there's something in the crops that isn't so great. But if you see everything as sort of a trade-off, I think the amount of people who will get long-term illnesses or die from, just letting street vendors sell their eggs on the side of the road, and just let people drink raw milk, and these practices that are just common in other countries, I think the trade-off will be worth it. You'll have a small uptick in maybe food-borne illnesses or deaths, but it's not like food-borne illnesses are plaguing these countries because street vendors are allowed to take stuff from their backyard and sell it on the street. So yeah, quick aside on that. Like, I'm always trying, instead of complaining, to think of solutions to making food cheaper, but definitely pulling back on regulations, emulating and looking to the countries where food is abundant, despite them not having, nearly as good low rates of poverty and things like that. Their food insecurity is much different because people are growing a lot more locally, and they're able to go to markets, and their purchasing power for food goes a lot further. Actually, one of the things is, like, you can look at some of the most food secure countries, short of the first world ones, because the first world countries are ultimately the most food secure despite the large inflation. Part of that is because we can buy food on credit. But the countries that can't still have fairly good food security. You'll get places like Qatar. Maybe that's not third world, but similar to that regard, Jordan, Costa Rica, places where they don't have the same sort of like civil infrastructure that we have. They won't have food security problems. And you can also say, oh, that's because they're close to the equator. India, Praveen just brought up maybe a good example there too. But yeah, so many factors. It's such a multifaceted thing. I can just go on and on about this. But what I really want to talk to you guys about is this idea of, punishment through taxation and price control specifically, because price controls are a thing that humanity and economists say is a bad idea, but humanity and governments try over and over and over again, not learning from history. And now you can look at, the history of price controls. It goes back 4,000 years. And you have to understand that, prior to the printing press, people didn't really have a good grasp on history. It was really hard to find out what happened, 500 years ago in the year 1400, for example, versus today, where we can see the entire history of everything at our fingertips. And so, being more readily available to learn from history hopefully will prevent more repetitious mistakes that humans and societies have made over the past. But specifically, price controls are something that is still attempted all the time. You can look at it specifically in a few countries that are considered communist, like Venezuela, Cuba. A lot of countries, a lot of leaders today are still implementing price controls on certain things. And you can look at price controls as ceiling prices for things, and you can look at price controls as sort of like minimums for things. So if you think about it, minimum wage is a form of price controls as well. But I think there's two sides to price controls. They're setting minimums for things and they're setting maximums for things. And I think the real inequality happens when you set those maximum prices for things. And that's really what I worry about with Trudeau when he says, there's no measure that we won't take to get food prices stabilized or lower. Because I think a guy like him, who admits that he doesn't really know any math, would implement something kind of as silly as that. So let's dive into history a little bit and look up the history of price controls and see where it has gotten certain nations. Uh, so let's go over like the basic economics of price controls. When you put a ceiling for a price on something, let's just say it's a loaf of bread, and you say, okay, no grocer is allowed, or no individual or grocer is allowed to sell a loaf of bread for over $5. What happens? Well, number one, the cost of production is always changing, and maybe it's floating upwards depending on what's going on with your currency, for example. Price ceilings on things generally create shortages. And if you don't understand why that works, I'll kind of break it down. If you are a bread producer and you can only get $5 per loaf and your expenses are increasing, what are you going to do? Well, eventually you get to a point where you're either making close to nothing or hardly anything. And so you have two outcomes. Either find a way to make your bread cheaper, sell the same thing for your $5 maximum, which results in really poor quality food, or just stop making food altogether. And usually, eventually, it comes to that before these price controls are broken, because people have to suffer and revolt and riot in the streets for politicians to get the message sometimes. So let's go back to 388 BC, where grain prices in Athens and Greece were out of control. Largely because Athenian rulers had an incredibly complex set of regulations on agriculture production and commerce, which included an army of grain inspectors appointed for the purpose of setting the price of grain at a level the Athenian government thought to be just. The penalty for avoiding these price controls was death, and many grain traders soon found themselves on trial facing such a punishment when it was discovered they were hoarding grain during a man-made shortage. So I would hope that we've come a little bit further than that. Hopefully, if you break Trudeau's price controls, he won't send you to the gulag or anything like that. But eventually, this thing completely collapsed. What is the first kind of result of these price controls is, as it becomes more and more unaffordable from a producer's perspective to make food, you start hoarding, number one. The price of food, on the black market goes up. And that's the secondary consequence, is essentially you create a black underground market for said good, because ultimately price is truth, and price discovery is a form of finding the truth. And the truth will always be found. The real price of something, no matter what a government will try and set it at, will always find truth outside of that jurisdiction. And it's the same thing that you see in all sorts of countries that try and set maximums for gasoline. Venezuela is a really good example. So in Venezuela, if you are a local Venezuelan, you can buy gasoline at, I think, like $1 or 50 cents a gallon. The government fixes a certain amount of the output and sends it to local gas stations. And as a citizen of Venezuela, you can go to these gas stations and get gas for a price that is just so much lower than any other place in the world. What is the result of that? Well, you have these massive, massive lineups. You can look it up. Gas station lineup, Venezuela. Gas lineups returning to Caracas when gas prices started going, far above this locally. So there's a set amount of gasoline that you get as a Venezuelan at this like fixed rate. And when gas prices exploded over the last 2 years, guess what started happening? Everybody was dipping in to get their free gas, even if it cost you multiple days of your productivity as well. So you'll get these mile-long gas stations. Of course, who wouldn't want to get subsidized gas at that price? But it has all these other, effects on your economy. People are sitting in their cars all day, polluting the air, idling, pushing their car maybe so they don't have to idle and burn more gas to get more gas. Ridiculous stuff like that. Total inefficiencies caused by bureaucracies trying to basically alter the physics of an economy, change gravity as we know it when it comes to supply and demand. So the Greeks learned from this. They had massive food riots, and ultimately this stuff got repealed. But let's jump a few years into the future here, to the French Revolution. So after the French Revolution, you might know that they had a lot of problems with inflation. They were losing their grasp on all their different colonies, and they kind of just didn't really understand that when you print more money, you don't necessarily create value. You devalue old debts, but you dilute the supply of your money. And so food prices, as a result, were skyrocketing. And so what did the French economists and leaders do? They put in something called the maximum rule, and they put price controls on not just grain, they put price controls on everything. So there's maximum food prices in every store for bread, wine, all necessities you can think of. And if you violated it, what would actually happen is someone would have to report you. They'd have to whistle blow, and then you'd be fined for double the price that you sold whatever that good for over the limit. And actually, instead of the government getting that fine, they would pay it to the informant, the person that busted you. And so that person could be the government or a government worker themselves, maybe one of those inspectors, or it could be an individual. So that's kind of crazy. The other thing that was pretty nuts on this too is because of the inflation, they tried to put hard caps on wages too. And so what you would end up getting is you get food prices going up 90% in one year and wages going up 80% in another, because the economists, they don't have a full grasp on everything, right? Again, you're trying to alter physics, the reality of the world. And so again, what was the result? The farmers, ended up hoarding food en masse, total hoarding. And it's a little bit easier sometimes with what the French consume. Their wine's pretty easy to just save wine and not sell it. Price of wine goes nuts. Bread, maybe you can cure it or do something. I don't know. Ways to maintain bread, whatever people could hoard and whatever the food producers could hoard, they hoarded. And so what you had is you had massive, massive food shortages across France, across these other colonies. And because of that, you ended up getting massive riots that led to the French Revolution. And there's other like tertiary stories here. Again, like I was saying, when you put a price cap on things like meat, what people do before they get priced out of the market entirely is the butchers would put scrap meat into your meat, and they would count that as the weight. What store owners would do is if they had second-rate shitty, apples and pears, they would sell those first. They would keep the nice ones. And then what they would do is they would sell those first-rate goods on the black market for what the real market was trying to sell them for. And so this all goes back to Trudeau. It all goes back to what, his measures are going to be. He's not going to price fix, I don't think. That would be pretty crazy. Be a pretty insane, quick accelerationist meltdown that would happen in Canada if he started to just declare maximum prices for food. Maybe he can come up with some sort of magical 21st century version of it where an algorithm is figuring out what the maximum price should be or some nonsense. But my guess is, as bad at math as he is, he's not that dumb. What he is doing, though, and a thing that you have to see to kind of understand why the price of things has kind of spiraled out of control, is all the other taxation measures that have added to the cost of supplying and moving food and generating it in the first place. So not only on a municipal level do we have land taxes going up for farmers all the time, we have the carbon tax. And so I'm going to sound like a conservative talking point here, but this is, I think, a really good point for people to see and think about when they think about taxation. So this is an old graph now. This is the amount of taxation on a liter of gas in Vancouver, 68 cents. So 68 cents of the 200 cents you pay per liter now, or 190 or whatever, 68 cents of that, 35. At one point, it was almost 50% of the cost of a liter of gas. is taxation. So you have a TransLink tax, public transport. That's okay. Some people like that we have publicly subsidized transit. We also have the cheapest transit in the world in Vancouver. So is this that necessary? People deciding, well, we should punish drivers for continuing to clog up the roads and then give the benefit to the TransLink takers by giving them cheaper transit. Good idea, bad idea, I don't know. It's really hard to balance these things, right? But then you go on to see, federal excise tax, 10 cents on every liter sold. Federal sales tax, 7.2 cents on every liter sold. 10 cents of carbon tax, right? We got to remove carbon from the atmosphere. We've got to flog you for your sins of emitting CO2 into the atmosphere, even though it's plant food technically, and even though volcanoes will produce more CO2 in one eruption than most nations do in 2 to 4 years. You got to pay your carbon tax. Oh, there's another carbon tax on there as well. Oh, a provincial excise tax. And here's the thing, these things have no caps. They will keep raising these and keep pushing these as far as they can. And they're able to kick the can down the road easier today on this type of taxation than any other time in history. Why? Because we have a fiat-based monetary system where you don't even have to have good credit to get credit. You can keep borrowing. And so you can kick the can much further than you normally could because people will go out of their way to get themselves into record amounts of debt, student loans, early payroll checks, all this stuff just to survive. And that's what you're seeing when you see all these, videos of people. You see these TikToks of people talking about how they can't take it anymore, right? They can't handle it anymore. Well, go back to the French Revolution, go back to Athens. The same conversations were happening, but decisive action was happening a lot quicker because they couldn't just borrow to make up for the shortfall, right? You get pushed to your absolute limit. You can't borrow anymore. You don't have enough money. You're not generating enough after working full time to survive. This is not a new story in history. And I know a lot of people think about it like that, like, oh, this is the most unaffordable things have ever been ever, right? Go back to the French Revolution. The Egyptians have been through it. The Greeks have been through it. The Romans have been through it. The British have been through it. Every major nation, the Dutch have been through it. Every major nation on earth has been through it. Because ultimately, inflation is caused by extra money. There is supply inflation, there's demand inflation, but ultimately, the natural tendency for all goods and services in the world, if governments couldn't create money and there was a fixed set of money, we know, and this is the thing that economists are actually worried about when it comes to Bitcoin, that if there was a fixed, a number of money that couldn't be altered, prices would just go down forever. We'd have to live in a completely different paradigm where we would get paid. We'd have to live in a different paradigm where we get nominally paid less every single year. But while we might be nominally making lower wages, we'd actually have more purchasing power over time under a deflationary currency. Instead, what you have is the opposite, where you're getting raises, but you're getting less purchasing power with every single one of those raises. And the way that we've been able to kick that can down the road for as long as we have is that we're letting people borrow money that they don't have, and that they are not, really worthy of lending to as well. When we create interest rates, when the Federal Reserve decides the interest rate for something, they're not letting the market accurately assess and figure out what the risk is of lending said money to someone else. Right now, the government will pay you 4% annually to, lend them. If you lend them some money, they'll pay you 4% annually. That is the risk. That is the risk premium that you're paying. A interest rate is essentially, the inverse rate of whatever the nominal risk is to lend somebody money. It's the reason that when you are yield farming or when you're going into one of these high interest plays or whatever, and they're paying out 100 or 200%, that high yield represents how risky it is that your initial investment can go to zero. So any place that's promising 100% return, what that is actually reflecting is massive risk that your entire capital could go to zero. So for the risk you are taking, the bare minimum you should be paid is at least 100%. And this is a lesson that I took a while to kind of like internalize and learn, but it happened with the whole Luna situation when they were paying people 20% on their fake dollars. And nobody really batted an eye. They thought, oh, great, 20% on a stable coin. How is that yield being generated? Well, it was being generated through an extremely risky protocol that was essentially sort of a fractional reserve system. And turns out, was it worth getting 20% a year when that system only existed for a year and a half before completely collapsing to zero? No. And so when you look at interest rates and you look at all these things, they represent risk. And when we take that risk and we give it into the hands of government, and they say crazy things like, we're going to win the war against inflation and our tool is interest rate policy, it's nonsense. They're trying to fight gravity. They're trying to fight physics. So what are the practical solutions to food inflation? How do you actually lower prices? Well, you create incentives to make food cheaper, right? You create incentives for people to actually want to grow more food. You make it so that people don't dread being a farmer as an occupation. You make it so that people who have had farms in their families for generations, the Gen Zers and the millennials, don't say screw this, because everything today is so much worse for them than when it was back in the day. And I'm not just talking about the prices for things, I'm talking about regulations. Why would you want to be a farmer in this day and age when you can't compete with factory farms? When there is like a malaise and a lack of nutrition in almost everything that people consume on a regular basis. The value of good, nutritious, healthy food that has been valued by humanity since the dawn of time has disappeared. People are willing to live more unhealthy lives and more compromised lives in their food standards than ever before, because they're just trying to survive on the income that they've earned or been given. Right. And so because of all these compromises we've taken on in our food, our governments have decided to compromise on our behalf as well. How do you compete as a farmer just trying to grow things normally of the good soil that your land is blessed with? It's next to impossible to compete. So you have to invert that on its head. You have to change, number one, a societal acceptance and a want to move towards more organic things. And I think there has been an attempt to do that, but price is still a massive barrier. Sure, you can put in, rules in place. You can't use hormones in chicken. I think some of those things are a good start. For instance, it makes the chicken producers for A&W or whatever more competitive because they can't, cheat their way into a fatter bird. But the number one thing that I feel contributes to food abundance is energy. And I think that stat is kind of clear as day. And again, all these things, like, they seem hard to connect. And I try every week to make these like 60-second videos explaining all these concepts. It's really hard to do in 60 seconds. But really, the cost of energy, I think, is a massive way of reducing food prices over the long term. And so carbon taxes increase the cost of energy. They increase the cost of food. This is proven by all statisticians that have looked into the price of food. These carbon taxes that exist when we buy our goods, that we pay some of the highest of in the entire world for, these carbon taxes make food much, much more expensive than it needs to be. And the question is what is the benefit that we're getting out of it, right? A pat on the back for saying that we emit less, that we're trying to be carbon neutral. I mean, we have to really, really ask ourselves the negatives and the positives to each of these things when we implement them. And people aren't involved in those conversations. And so bureaucrats who have, loony ideas about economics, math, and the environment get to make these policies on our behalf. And we trust them. We don't verify enough ourselves. We trust them to do the work. So you get this carbon tax that keeps compounding. These taxes are anywhere between 30 to 50% of the cost of gas. Not all of them are carbon taxes, but other provincial taxes, whatnot, downstream of a carbon tax, maybe. And then you have governments saying, we don't want you drilling for oil. We don't want you building new nuclear plants. We don't want you creating abundant sources of electricity. And I think, again, the perfect correlation for this, if you really want to see a perfect correlation, Iceland, Norway, expensive places to live if you're us, but food security there, food availability, food purchasing power, affordability in those countries is better than any other place in the world. And the number one thing that, people will probably go to first, they'll say, oh, well, they have a good government there. They have good socialist policies that ensure equality and all these things. But what I think is the reason that food availability and food prices and affordability are the best in those, kind of Nordic countries is because those countries have abundant energy resources that they have exploited or used to their fullest ability. Iceland, almost entirely hydroelectric geothermal. There's no holding back on that. Why would they? It's renewable energy. Why would you, have a scarcity mindset versus an abundance mindset? Well, you can't grow everything there. It's not a perfect climate for growing everything, but you can have almost unlimited electricity. And with unlimited and dirt cheap electricity in Iceland, you can have greenhouses that run all year round. You don't have to worry about food scarcity. You can build things. You can move things from A to B. Norway, infamous place for all the oil and gas that they have. And so they've taxed that stuff and they've probably taxed it appropriately enough to not deter the drilling of new oil. It's still profitable for companies to go into Norway and to extract oil. And they've taken that money and they've taken regulations off so that these companies can produce natural, abundant sources of energy so that number one, energy prices go down, but you get the second order effect of food prices going down as well. And you look at places like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, places in the middle of nowhere where you wouldn't really want to grow food or you couldn't just grow it in the ground. They have super affordable food there too. Why is that with such a crazy harsh climate, 41 degrees in the middle of the day and 8 degrees at night? Abundant energy. Energy takes care of all of this stuff. Energy is what fuels the technology that can make every single thing in our lives cheaper. And so it just drives me insane when you have these anti-abundant policies when it comes to energy. You have nonsense about, we don't want to build, nuclear plants because, this spill happened this one time and we're never going to get better at handling them. A bunch of nonsense. In fact, on the topic of nuclear energy, one of the best performing companies this year is Cameco Corp. Because I think in this era, this big lesson that we learned in the last 2 years that we shouldn't rely on, one country, Russia, for all our oil needs, it's driven so many more countries to start saying, hey, we need energy independence. What's one of the best energy sources there is? We can't build hydro dams, geothermal, solar, wind. One of the best energy sources, nuclear. And so you have Cameco here. This is the number one uranium company in the world, the second largest uranium producer, 18% of all uranium in the world. It's up 400% in the last 3 years. That is just humans finding, the logical step for energy abundance. So question any politician, question anyone that says we don't need energy abundance or we shouldn't be pursuing one form of energy over the other. You want to pursue the energy that gives you the best bang for your buck, whether that's fossil fuels, whether that's nuclear, whether that's solar, whether that's wind. Not every single energy source can cover all your bases. There's pros and cons to each one. I know developing nuclear plants is very expensive in the short term, but they pay off in the long term. I would say under a fiat regime where money is constantly devaluing right now, one of the best things that you can do is get into a lot of debt building a nuclear facility. Because while it may not be ROI positive today, if your money's going to perpetually devalue, your debt's going to get washed away anyways. So if I was a debtor nation, and I was, importing way, way, way too much, and I had a really shitty currency, I'd spend a ton of that currency and I'd, get my shit together. I'd look up, some good practices for building nuclear plants, and I'd build nuclear plants like crazy. And eventually, when the whole thing comes crashing down, you might not have a great currency, but you have abundant energy. And that is the building block to having a functional society in the long term. So yeah, that's my rant. Cheap, abundant energy will be the only thing that lowers food prices in the long term, and not just food prices, everything. Technology, transportation. Don't forget that 50% of all oil consumed is for road transportation. Road transportation, not boats, not trains, not planes. Roads. So physical cars on the road, physical freighters on the road. 50% of all oil on Earth consumed by those things, and we know that industry is getting disrupted. All right. Quickie news. I hope those rants made sense. I'm going to try and cut some of them up and make them into shorter clips for people. All right. Quickie news. Into some Bitcoin stuff. We haven't talked about Bitcoin during this whole thing, but when I talk about deflation, I'm secretly wink, wink, nudging at Bitcoin. A Bitcoin miner, this is an interesting story. So earlier this week, a company named Paxos, they do stable coins and a whole bunch of like banking and crypto services. They handle, I think, the custody or some of the cryptocurrency on behalf of PayPal. They sent $2,000 worth of Bitcoin, but they paid a $520,000 fee. And so everyone was like pointing this out because they can see all the stuff in the blockchain. They're running like, why is that? And turns out it was a bug in the system. But the interesting thing about this is that one pool got this, crazy overpaid fee of $520,000 to send just 2,000 bucks, and they returned it to Paxos. Didn't have to do it, but did it. And so there's a lot of questions raised by that, like, well, that's nice of them, but doesn't that also kind of speak about like the centralization of Bitcoin mining? Like in a very decentralized open market, look, if you want to pay your dumb fee due to a bug, like you ain't getting that back. But I guess thanks to the generosity of one pool, which does control a lot of the hash rate, they're able to give that stuff back. But again, hash rate can be distributed in like a snap of your fingers. So if there's a pool that's not acting in the best interest of the miners that are contributing hash rate, you just leave the pool, join another one that is working on your best behalf. This is more of like an entertainment story, but I'm curious. I don't know if there's many people in like the writing industry or maybe working union jobs. There's been a writer's strike in Hollywood for the last 6-7 months. They're asking for a big pay raise, all these things that are natural byproducts of inflation and always precede recessions. And some TV hosts are saying, well, we've had enough. Like, we love our writers, but it's been 7 months. Like some of us want to get back to work. And so, the union frontline people and the union supporters go out and they call these people scabs and all these like union breakers and all that. But fact is like people don't want to sit around, wasting their good years, not producing or doing anything. They want to put a show out. They want to entertain people. They want to get their voice heard. And so, it's interesting. You're starting to see people starting to break this strike because the big media conglomerates are just not giving in. Some of the demands from the unions are a little bit nutty as well. You're just starting to see people naturally like, 7 months is too much. Like, how long is too long for a strike? I think when you start approaching a year or two, humans only live, 80, should really spend that much time of our life and our career fighting to get a higher raise when we're only going to work so many more years. I think you're particularly seeing it across older actors too, or who are, they're like, okay, maybe I have like 10 good years left. I don't want to spend a year of that striking. Kind of interesting stuff. Speaking of deflation, because I do think deflation is abundant even in our inflationary world of inflationary currencies. This is, let's see if I can blow this up here. This is a list of car prices over the last 9 months. So I'll go over a few of them here. Why are car prices going down? Well, I made a short, and maybe I've talked about it on the show, something called a bullwhip effect, where when you have a big supply constraint and you get all this pent up demand, eventually when that supply comes back in, everybody scoops up everything. And then the demand doesn't really calibrate the suppliers of said goods don't really calibrate to what the real demand is. So they just start overproducing to make up for the shortages that they had. And so you get this bullwhip effect where essentially, everything in tight demand during the pandemic, which we saw, and now overabundance of stuff on store shelves, but particularly cars are getting hit. So you probably all remember, really hard to get a used car a few months ago. Now new cars, you got the Tesla Model S starting this year at $120,000 new. Now it's going for $82,000. So in 9 months, the Tesla Model S, the MSRP has dropped 31%. Tesla's been hit harder than almost all the other cars too, like YX3. Like they've all dropped 20 to 30% in 9 months. So I'd feel like a bit of a chump buying a new Tesla. And to me, I'm not an electric car guy yet. Like I'm gonna be one of the last people to get an electric car, because I just think the infrastructure for them is so poor still. And to me, there's no point in really upgrading until it can like self-drive anyways. I'm gonna be one of the last people to buy these things, but man, this just confirms my my happiness that I didn't buy one earlier this year or back in the bull market, because now you can get, the same or a better car for so much cheaper. So yeah, I find that interesting. Speaking of electric cars, speaking of oil, oil prices rising to the highest in 2023, despite tight supply expectations. So we don't have a ton of time left. I'm going to try and run through these in the next like 10, 15 minutes. I don't like to keep you guys over an hour here, especially while most parts of the world still getting good weather in September. I'll make longer shows in the winter. Oil prices highest in 10 months. This is kind of contributing back to inflation having this bit of an uptick as well. My take on oil prices is that I think technology is phasing out its dependency on oil over time. That's kind of what Kathy Wood's view is on this. And I'm not, I think fossil fuels have contributed to environmental destruction. They've maybe contributed to, global temperatures warming. I don't really care if they have, to be honest, because I think that whatever the benefits of using them versus not using them way outweigh whatever the temperature of our Earth is going to increase by. That's just my take. But anyways, fossil fuels, they're much more abundant than we have predicted. You all heard that, oh, the Earth's going to run out at our current drilling amount. But every single year, they seem to find new pockets of oil in the world, and we come up with new techniques to extract more oil. And so this idea that we're going to run out of oil is kind of nuts. But we're going to stop using nearly as much oil as we do anyways, naturally, because of natural market forces. We're going to have energy that is more abundant than oil. We're going to have energy that is denser than oil, and we're going to have energy that is maybe more portable than oil. And I'm specifically talking about nuclear in that sense. But right now, when you have oil prices rising, and one of the reasons that I really don't like trading oil or looking at oil prices for things as like, an indicator of, I guess, well, I just don't believe the oil price. I'll just put it out like that, because I think the demand is very easy to predict with oil. Economies growing, population growth. You can kind of project oil demand and usage. We're not really inventing new things anymore that are using oil. Like back in the 1800s, you would never predict how much oil we would use in the future. But now that, we've had this steadily growing population, the number of cars per human has kind of leveled off, and the amount of trucks on the road per human is kind of leveled off. We know what oil demand is going to look like for the next 50 to 100 years if we didn't change anything. But the supply is the thing that's really hard, because essentially you have OPEC, you have all these different places, and you have different carbon guidelines that prevent people from drilling where it needs to be drilled. But we do know that there is much more oil out there, and it just needs seeking a lot of the time. And so that will to seek for it, it rises as the price of oil rises. So, the more profitable it is to drill for oil, the more people are going to go out and look. And when oil is not profitable, people stop looking. And so you have that dynamic, but then you also have this dynamic where you have artificial constraints on supply. You have artificial regulatory constraints. So certain countries not letting you frack or drill or whatever, even though you have a ton of oil under your feet. Long term, the outlook is grim for oil, because again, 50% of cars are, or 50% of oil demand comes from street cars. And I think as we find alternative sources of energy that are abundant and we can make that more universal, I was thinking the other day, Vancouver has more Teslas per capita, I think, than almost any other place in the world. And I was trying to figure out, why is that? Well, maybe it's because we have a whole bunch of rich investors here, and people rich off real estate, and they want their electric car. And, it's a left-leaning place on the West Coast. But another factor I wasn't thinking about, and I think maybe makes some sense, is that we also have the cheapest electricity in some parts of the modern world here. So it makes sense to own a Tesla, right? You can charge it up for basically nothing. We got subsidized electricity. I think we have pretty good infrastructure here. But anyways, the point is I think most of the world will look like Vancouver with their electric cars, as each country and each nation sort of figures out how to get maximum energy abundance and maximum energy production over the long term. To be frank, you will see countries like Saudi Arabia, where their number one energy source is oil. You will see factories turning oil into electricity to charge up their cars. And that's okay. Some people look at that and they're like, oh, that's hypocrisy. Your fossil fuels are fueling your Tesla. It's just well, no, you use whatever electricity source is the cheapest ultimately. And whether that's based on oil or geothermal or nuclear or whatever, right? You use what's cheapest, and then you get to drive your car for cheap. And eventually, it's just my take that all other energy sources will accumulate to become net cheaper than oil, even at some of the cheapest prices you can produce oil for. And that in of itself will bring down the cost of oil. So yeah, electrification long term will naturally bring the demand for oil down. The question will be is how much more will they manipulate the supply just so that they can, get by on the price of oil. And I think there is a long-term dread that the demand for oil globally is going to decrease over time as we move to electric cars. And so that's why you're seeing a lot more shenanigans in the world of oil now than you may have a couple of years ago. Still have wars and whatnot fought over oil. All right, last story here. Franklin Templeton breaking into the Bitcoin ETF game. So if you're tired of hearing about BlackRock and Valkyrie and iShares and whatever, we got one more person looking to enter the ETF game, Fidelity. It's Franklin Templeton. They have $1.4 trillion in assets, not as big as BlackRock, but still pretty big, looking to get an ETF approval for spot Bitcoin. And so I don't know if the story's really changed on this after the whole Grayscale thing. So we know that Grayscale won their ruling. The judge said that, hey, this whole surveillance thing, you're not treating these ETFs really fairly. Your reason for rejecting them isn't that great. So the SEC has, two things that they can do here. They can either come up with a new reason for rejecting ETFs. They can't use the current one that they've been using for 10 plus years about surveillance policies. They got to come up with a new reason for not accepting Bitcoin ETFs, which will be interesting to see, and probably the likely outcome if I'm being pessimistic, or they're going to approve one. And the odds of approval gets higher if one of their main counterpoints gets struck down, because essentially they have a limited budget. They got to keep fighting these lawsuits over and over and over. And eventually a judge will say, clean slate, all your dumb excuses don't fly. It's just inevitable over time. So I think these ETFs are much closer than ever. And I think that's why you're seeing more and more people jump into the race. They're feeling it out, maybe from a legal perspective too. So, BlackRock and all these ETFs, they started submitting, their applications like 4 or 5 months ago before all these lawsuits were kind of lost by the SEC. I think knowing that that was inevitably going to happen. And so you might have legal scholars on your team that can kind of like figure out what the cases are going to be. And my guess is that they took a look maybe a year ago and they realized like the SEC is kind of coming into a bind here. We've got a new election year coming up. We might have favorable legislation for Bitcoin. We got to get our foot in the door, because if we wait all the way until a regime change, if we wait until the SEC loses these lawsuits, these other companies like Grayscale are going to get first dibs on the Bitcoin ETF. And so that's kind of my theory for why you saw these applications, is I think it's just like the perfect time before, this gets approved. They have some runway to get their little delays and rejections and all that, but they have to get their foot in the door. They have to get their boat and their car in the race, because if they waited another year or two, it would have taken a long time and they wouldn't have been first. And being first mover on these ETFs is a really, really important thing, because they're going to push it essentially. Somebody made a post the other day that when you see BlackRock and you see Fidelity and all this, they get involved in Bitcoin ETFs. Not only will they be big marketers for all of these things, they're going to say, oh yeah, go buy some Bitcoin ETFs. They're going to do interviews, add some Bitcoin in your portfolio. They will take their own portfolios, their own indexes, their own index funds, and they will start saying, yeah, we're going to add some Bitcoin ETF to our own index, the S&P 500 indexes, or we just have regular portfolio indexes that people just blindly buy. They don't care what's in it. And so Fidelity and all these companies, they're going to just start adding their own Bitcoin ETFs into those lump sum diversified ETFs. So yeah, they want to have their skin in the game. We'll see what happens. I give it, I think next year's the year. I don't think it's this year. I think next year's the year that we see a Bitcoin spot ETF approval. And you know the math. You know that when these get approved, the price of Bitcoin triples, in my opinion. It triples in about 2 months. So that'll be my call. You can go back and watch this video. One of these spot Bitcoin ETFs get approved. I think it triples in 2 months, the price of Bitcoin. So it goes from 20 to 60 or 30 to 90 or whatever. But that is the catalyst. And my other take on this is that we don't need a spot Bitcoin ETF approval to get there. I think eventually, I think we saw this year with all those banks collapsing in the way that Bitcoin reacted to that, that if we have contagion in the general economy and we get money printing again, that's also a catalyst higher. So yeah, there's your hopium for the day. Clocking in at an hour 5 here. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. I really appreciate it. Hope you appreciate me rattling off here for an hour and a half. Check out the comments here. We got Bennett. Freeland says she lives downtown and drives a bike to work, which according to her is the model for all Canadians. Yeah, if there's one thing you're going to push in Canada, riding a bike is not a great one because like most of the year, that is a death sentence. If you look at the way that streets are maintained in most cities, I don't care about your bike lanes when you have ice on the road. You don't want to be biking. It's funny that politicians and everyone is so pro biking. I go on runs now. I like that. It doesn't get you as far or as fast as a bike does, but I don't know about this halfway thing. I think I'm more of a running or a car guy. But yeah. Anyways, thanks so much for watching, everyone. Don't forget to like the video, and I will see you all next week. More shorts coming, more documentaries coming, more live streams coming. So many cool things coming. I'm excited. I'm more excited than I've ever been about creating stuff about Bitcoin, even though the price hasn't moved much. I think people are waking up. Bitcoiners are getting more involved than ever before. And despite all the lunacy in the world, we are the ones that are paving the future. And we're going to make this a great world to live in. I'm positive for the future. I think common sense, it feels as far away from things, but I see it with the people I'm in. I see more radical amounts of common sense in the people that I talk to these days than I ever have. And that makes me very bullish and optimistic for the future. So yeah, let's go. Have a good weekend.